these conversations are often had through a political lens. And many people really look through what is a delicate, sensitive issue and look at it maybe from one news source or another news source on the opposite end. And so what we see is some truth over here, some truth over there, but we see a lot of also untruths and shouting back and forth, and we don't really connect and make a difference. The good thing in the sort of our unique position, because you can get that just about anywhere, the way we're approaching this is through the redemptive lens of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, that should bring people together from all different colors, ethnicities, races, countries, even politics, and bring us together at the foot of the cross. And so that is what we want to do in these conversations. And tonight, our focus is we're going to focus on the increasing rise in hate and hostility and violence against our Asian American brothers and sisters. And we want to have that conversation tonight and have some guests that speak about that. And once again, this opportunity is one where we want to be full of truth and full of grace, just like Jesus is. And so I want to thank you again for joining in. On Facebook, you can ask questions, and that will sort of be fed over to us. You can make comments, and I would encourage you to share this and just let others know kind of what's happening with us. But at this point, I want to turn it over to my, as always, co-host, Jaleith. Should you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much, Bill, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Jaleith Gary. I am a staff member at Calvary Fellowship. This will be my first time being a staff member during the Race and Redemption episode, and I identify as Black African American. My family has a Jamaican, Nicaraguan, and Native American background, but obviously I navigate the world as a Black woman. And I'm just really excited to be able to help host this platform to give my brothers and sisters an opportunity to share their experiences. Sam, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Jaleith. My name is Sam. I'm so glad to be here. First of all, I just want to thank Bill and Jaleith.
Give my brothers and sisters an opportunity to share their.
And I know there's a lot of hard work that happens behind the scenes for hosting things like this. So I just wanted to say thank you for your generosity and your kindness and your hospitality. I am Korean American, second generation, or first generation, depending on how you define it. My father came to this country for the 45 years ago as a young man, 27-year-old, on a student visa to go to grad school in Philadelphia. And that was in the mid 70s. So I grew up in the United States, moved all around. I was a military brat. My father was active duty in the United States Army for 30 years. So I had the typical military brat experience. And I just want to thank you for the invitation and looking forward to sharing and to hearing from my fellow panelists too. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Stephanie, would you mind telling us about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Jaleith, and thank you, Sam. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experiences. My background is that my parents came to the U.S. My father from China to Spain, where he got his PhD, and then came to New York City in his about early 40s, late 30s. My mother came from Taiwan and went into the Cathedral High School in New York City at age 21. And that's where my parents met, of course, after my mom left the nunnery. So I am American born, my brother and my parents did end up opening 3 Chinese restaurants. So the Chinese culture was still ingrained in me, and Chinese was actually my first language here. And I was almost kept back in kindergarten because I didn't have English, even though I was American born. So I guess I'm considered first generation Chinese, Taiwanese. But I'm looking forward to sharing my experience with all of you and the church body.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Angela, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, thank you, everyone. My name is Angela. So my parents also, they came, both of them, my mom and my dad, came from Taiwan on a student visa as well for grad school. My dad actually, their family went from China to Taiwan and actually to Brazil before coming to the United States for school, for grad school. And so I was born in New York City, and I actually just moved from New York City to Connecticut this past year. Yeah, so I identify as Taiwanese American. So I'm excited to also share a little bit about my experience with all of you.
Thank you, Angela. And Harvey, we can't forget about you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sorry about that. Unmute. Hey guys, my name is Harvey. I'm so honored to be here and the opportunity that Bill and Jaleith and Chip has put this together for us to, allow us to share our voice, our stories. Yeah, so I am Chinese American. I identify as Chinese American. I'm first generation. My mom came from Hong Kong. My dad came from Canton, China, and they and they immigrated into the United States a while back. But it's really off the heels of my grandfather, because he served in World War II for the United States, and because of that, he was able to bring his entire family into the United States. Very proud of that. And because he was able to bring his entire family to the United States, my father, along his wife, my mom, was able to come over here, and I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Very proud of that. And then for my wife, her grandfather on her dad's side served in World War II as well. So that was pretty interesting, but he was a little bit more braver. He served on the front line in Europe. So that was pretty intense. Yeah, so both Jen and I, we are so thankful that our grandfathers, we're very proud that our grandfathers served in World War II for the United States. And then it was a great story of immigration, and here we are. So thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. As I told you all before, I want to thank you for being our guests on here. And I know that to enter a conversation like this can be challenging and difficult, but just for everyone watching this here tonight, we're all Christians. We're all part of the same church, and we're thankful that a lot of people are maybe watching this that aren't part of our church, or maybe you're not even a Christian. As we always say, tonight some of our hope is gonna come from that place that Jesus brings. And even if you're not a Christian, I think you're gonna get some value tonight out of hearing stories and experiences and perspective from people. I know that you will, but I wanna thank every one of you for being a part of this conversation. So without further ado, what I wanna do is I'll just ask some questions. Jaleith will ask some questions, and then we wanna give you guys space to share your stories. So the first thing is, as I mentioned when we started, that we have seen a dramatic uptick over the course of the past year in violence and hatred against the Asian American community. And what I'd like to know is, can you share maybe some of your experience with this during this time over the past year, or maybe even going back longer over the course of your lifetime? And so each of you feel free to speak up, and couple of you start talking at one time, you guys can just figure it out, but I'm gonna hit mute and start listening.
I guess I'll go first.
Okay.
So I know that some of my fellow panelists have some stories that they can share. For me personally, I have not had any anti-Asian harassment or violence on me directly, but I do know that the anti-Asian sentiment exists. And throughout my life, I've experienced discrimination. Throughout my life, I've witnessed it, I've lived it. And one thing I did want to kind of share, kind of first, going way back, if you could just kind of allow me to do like a quick history lesson, if I could, is many of you know the name Vincent Chin, and he is an Asian American, was an Asian American. He was a Chinese American who was bludgeoned to death by two men in 1982, Detroit. Two white auto workers. They were two men that were related. One was a father, the other one was his son-in-law. And Vincent Chen was a 27-year-old Chinese American man who was killed. And I think, in the Asian American studies curriculum in college or Asian American activist circles, Vincent Chin's story is very well known. However, it's probably not very well known in the larger public. So that's why I wanted to bring his name up. It was 1982. It was a long time ago, but it was within my lifetime. And so the story was that Vincent Chin was engaged to be married. He was celebrating with his friends. They were throwing him a bachelor party, and a bar fight ensued. And these two men, one held him to the ground while the other used a baseball bat to beat him. And so this was 1982 Detroit, where it was a powder keg of anti-Asian sentiment. And that was because of the presence of the Japanese car makers penetrating the US market. And there was a lot of resentment that was happening, and a lot of blame was put on Asian Americans in the area. And I guess there were recent layoffs, and the blame was put on various Asian Americans in the area. So Vincent Chen was beaten. He was beaten so bad that he sustained head trauma and was taken to the hospital and died 4 days later. What's the most tragic thing about this story is that these two white men, they were charged with second-degree murder, but later their charges were dropped. They were dropped to manslaughter. I'm sorry, they were dropped to manslaughter, and they were ordered to pay $3,000 and 3 years probation and 0 jail time. These men never denied that the fight occurred. They claimed that the fight was not racially motivated, but eyewitnesses would beg to differ. And so there was an outcry, a public outcry, and when this happened, people like Jesse Jackson and the Black community joined in alongside to call for stronger federal hate crime legislation, and it had national attention. So this was 1982, about 40 years ago. But I guess the thing I would like to say is, yes, it was maybe another time, another era, right? But not for Asian Americans. The year 2020 was a brutal year for all of us, but especially for Asian Americans. And I think that's why we're having this forum today, to raise awareness, to speak truth, unapologetically to speak the truth. And, because Asian Americans are being scapegoated and blamed and harassed and shunned and assaulted, sometimes violently, because of the pandemic and because of other reasons. And I just wanted to say that, this goes without saying, but unequivocally, racism in general and anti-Asian hate specifically is unacceptable, period.
Thank you, Sam. Wholeheartedly agree. Stephanie, you looked like you were also going to share.
Yeah, like Sam, I personally had not experienced any anti-Asian hate prior to the pandemic, and even in the younger years. However, I've had spoken to a few people. I actually went to a brewery this weekend and ran into an adopted Korean girl who was adopted by American white parents. And she spoke to a friend of hers who actually got sprayed with Lysol and said, "You have COVID and you need to get away from me." She also had the commissioner of the workers' comp department say to her when she was being interviewed for jury duty, you probably shouldn't come. You probably have the flu. You probably have COVID because you're Asian. And she was just, she didn't say anything. And again, that goes to the, Asians being kind of quiet about it, not really wanting to make a stink about things. Personally, in my experience, from whether it's a joking standpoint or whatnot, or from people that don't really know me, it's I feel like Asian women have been stereotyped as being sexualized. You get comments sometimes as being an Asian female, oh, you must give really good massages, or do you work for, a massage parlor? Or, oh, I've always had dreams of dating an Asian woman. What is that like? Like, it's so different. So when the massage parlors got shut up, I felt like, Asian hate, but also there was a different tone to it too, where the person had, a sexual addiction. And I can actually relate to that, because I feel like some men in the US, I mean, because of whether it's movies that are depicting Asian women as being meek and micey and quiet and very submissive to men, because that is kind of following with the Asian culture. So yeah, again, like Sam, not directly at me, but just more kind of in passing and with just stereotypes.
Thank you, Stephanie. Harvey, I know that you had something happen to someone near and dear to you. Would you mind answering the same question, however you want to answer it? But...
Oh yeah, this whole issue is actually very near and dear to me. So yeah, my father, he was just sometime last year, just walking down the street of Dumbo, Brooklyn, and minding his own business, and this young kid just pushed him really hard to the ground, for no apparent reason, and he got scuffed up pretty bad. So I just thank God that my dad was okay. He's also built like a bull, even at 84. So I praise God for that. And then Jen, my wife, and one could say it maybe could be racism, it could not be racism, but in broad daylight, she was robbed, she was mugged. I mean, she went home, and then she later found out that she realized that, yeah, she was, somebody, bumped into her and stole from her. But so that was us personally. But for me, I've experienced racism, microaggression, you name it, throughout my life, and for me, it's like, I can manage the microaggressions or even ignoring me and stuff like that. I've developed I like to say I developed a thick skin for that. Or even brushing me aside, where I draw the line is when you attack the elders. You cross the line when you attack, because elders in our culture are very significant, because our culture is very family oriented, the family unit, and we have very, very respect for our elders, right? And the women in our culture, we always hate to see any form of stereotypes and stuff like that. To Stephanie's point, all of this thing that Hollywood made of the women. So what I'm talking about is our most vulnerable, the vulnerable in our communities that are being violently attacked. And that's why I'm choosing to speak up really loud and clear, because that's when you cross the line. That's when you really cross the line. And it's my passion now. It's really my passion to move the needle, to find voice, to share our stories, and really, really learn from other communities, especially the African-American community. I think we have so much to learn from them, and build allyship, learning, understanding. So yeah, my hope is to really, spread awareness, build allyship, and draw attention to all of this. So thanks.
So I wanted to share a little also. I think, so currently I'm a teacher in Manhattan in a middle school. And right before the pandemic was starting, they had me teach a couple of health classes. I'm a science teacher, and I guess that job becomes something that the science teacher ends up doing. So teaching middle school health class, like right before the pandemic, I was sharing a little bit about COVID and printing out articles for students to read. And I remember bringing up the topic that I had. So after college, I had actually spent a year teaching English in China. So I was actually in the city of Wuhan. And I remember when I shared that with my students, this was back in 2010, they were like kind of shocked, but almost looked at me and like, almost like, I don't know, it was like a sudden change of like seeing something that was maybe a little too close to home before the pandemic. But I feel like it suddenly like, it brought up in me the sense of shame about my own culture that I didn't realize was very much still present sometimes. That growing up in America, I grew up in New Jersey, born in New York City, moved to New Jersey, and in a very suburban, predominantly white school. I think I definitely grew up with a sense that I was a little different in the sense of I was Asian, right? And I definitely heard comments about like, our eyes, or just like, students sometimes trying to speak to you in Chinese, and clearly not. But, and so a sense of like being foreign, within the place that you're born. And so I think there was always a sense of like not wanting to seem too Chinese, and kind of wanting to like assimilate, and even hiding parts of myself that I felt were maybe different, and one of those things was like, every, I think, Asian child at school during lunchtime, you're always afraid that your parents packed you something that was not, something your other classmates recognized. One of it was like seaweed. And I remember my parents would pack me like those packs of seaweed, which we all eat now, and you can find in Trader Joe's. But I remember hiding them because I remember my friend made a comment about how it smelled fishy and weird. And so I think there was always that sense of like not wanting to stand out and be different. And I always felt like if I assimilated, or, if my English was good and I could, communicate much better than my parents could, because they did struggle in their workplaces not being able to speak English, like people would see me as just one of them, and I think with the recent uptick in hate crimes, and I think it's definitely made me recognize some of those emotions that maybe I had kind of hidden away, or I didn't realize was there. But also a sense of feeling the need to definitely speak up, and like it's definitely arisen in me the need to not feel afraid to say when something is wrong, or to bring up something that I think should definitely be spoken about and against, and I definitely think I don't know what it is. Maybe it's my own upbringing, just not feeling like always like I have a voice to always speak up sometimes about the things that are that I feel like I should, and I feel like right now during this time, it's important, I think, for the Asian American community to realize that we have a voice to, one, share about our experiences, and two, to also speak out against things that we know are wrong. And number three, also to really do the work in, building solidarity with different minority communities, and recognizing some of the things that we might, feel or think that are not in alliance with, just, I don't know how to exactly voice it, but like being open to recognizing our own things that we think that are wrong too, and not open to understanding others and their experiences. And so, yeah, that's like one of the things I felt like I wanted to share in relation to what's been going on.
Yes, thank you, Angela. We actually have a question coming in from Facebook. I would like to know which of the participants have children, especially school-age children. Thanks, Sean.
Max is turning 6 in May, but he is a mixed child who looks predominantly white, I would say. I think that you'd have to really look at him sometimes in the eyes. People can see that he looks Asian.
And I have 2 children, my wife and I. My wife, like me, is Korean American, second generation. So we actually regard our 2 kids as third generation. And I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son.
Hey, Max.
Hi, Max.
Yeah, so I have 2 boys, Josh and Zach. Josh is 13 and Zach is 10 years old.
You can smile.
Yeah. I guess they're like second, third generation, one of those.
That's great. Thank you guys for sharing that. Thank you, Sean, for asking the question. What I would like to, I guess, I want to ask this question, and as we go forward, and I think someone needs to mute. We're picking up some background noise, but as we go forward, thank you guys for sharing this experience, because for a lot of people, we don't have the same experience as you. And I know that it's so complicated because even in the, the lead up to this conversation, we were talking about how whenever we have sort of race discussions, and we talked about this when we talked about talking to our Latino brothers and sisters, that it usually ends up with sort of the black-white kind of conversation, and sometimes we don't have conversations like this, which is important for us to have. And but I guess what I want to ask you guys is, as you talk about the last year and how a lot of this is now coming to the surface, is how has this impacted you? And some of you guys have already shared some of that, maybe mentally, emotionally. And then Harvey, you when we were talking in the lead up to this, you said that one of the things is that a lot of Asian Americans are feeling invisible. And I'd love, and you shared some 3 great reasons for that, and that were super helpful. So I'd love if during this part, as we talk about how we're processing it and how everyone's feeling, if you could touch on that too. But again, whoever kind of wants to go first, I'm not trying to direct the order there.
Yeah, Bill, I'll go first. So I can totally relate to what Angela was sharing about how I feel like people treat me because of how I look, like other, like, quote unquote other, like an outsider, like a foreigner, because of how I look. Actually, when I saw the reports that began to come out last year of anti-Asian hate crimes, I actually thought, honestly, they were one-offs. I actually didn't think, okay, this can't be widespread, could it? Our society will always have these one-off acts of hate or hate crimes, and it can't be widespread, right? And then we got more and more reports. And so as an Asian American, I would walk around and hate the fact that I would walk around suspicious of everyone and anyone who's in my path, living in fear. And moreover, fear of my wife's safety, fear of my kids' safety, fear of my parents' safety. I have a sister who lives in New York City, where in the city centers and in urban settings, these types of crimes happen a lot more. And so I was having a discussion with my sister who lives in Manhattan, who literally was afraid to leave her apartment for months. And today I would speak to her, and she is afraid to take the subway because it's not, and it's not because of COVID. It's because of this living in fear. One thing I kind of wanted to quickly share was there is a book by a Harvard professor. It's actually a collection of essays. It's not Christian. She's not a Christian, but it's a book called Ordinary Vices. And she talks about things like hypocrisy and betrayal. And those are some of the examples that she writes about. And there was a vice that I thought was very interesting that she wrote about. It's the vice of cruelty. And if we look at the Beatitudes, and if we look at, because my home fellowship is studying the Beatitudes, we're forced to kind of think about all the opposite character traits that the Beatitudes kind of express. And so we look at pride, we look at self-centeredness, and those are offenses. Those are offense to God. But cruelty is an interesting, she calls it an ordinary vice. It's an interesting vice in that cruelty is a sin against a person, maybe an indirect sin against God, but it's a sin against another person. Cruelty could be, towards a living creature like an animal. Cruelty could be towards a person, and maybe a person that does not look like you. And so cruelty is a vice that's universal, I think. And I think when we see it we are outraged by it universally, Christian or not, right? But cruelty is something that we see across the country, and then specifically towards Asians, and it's dehumanizing, is what we feel. It's kind of demonizing. That's what's happening, and I think just like how what Harvey was sharing, it's happening to the most vulnerable, to elderly, to women, and we cannot just stand by and let it continue. There's one stat that says that women are twice as likely as men to be victims of anti-Asian harassment or crime. So that's why we're talking today, because we have to have a collective outrage whenever you see that. And you got to kind of ask yourself, am I part of the solution on this? Or maybe a better question is, how can I be a part of the solution on this?
Thank you, Sam. Any of you guys want to chime in?
Talking about invisible, growing up, my dad, and a lot of it is culture, my dad never wanted us to make a scene about anything. If there was ever an issue to complain at a restaurant, never. It was just always be quiet. And there's that term, saving face. He never wanted, it's always, you have to save face. It's always honorable to, to put your best foot forward and look like, be proud of, all of the good things in you. Don't talk about the bad things about yourself. Also be humble. It was always just never stand out. My father always, and he was very, very traditional Chinese, my dad. So when we say the invisible, yeah, I think a lot of the Asian hate prior to the pandemic was maybe masked by the whole black and white. It's always been a bigger issue between black and white. And now that the pandemic has come out, it's finally, opening people's eyes to, wow, there's, there's Asians, and I haven't really seen a lot of Latino, but even if you watch TV, it's all black and white. Everybody, there's always white, there's black, but you don't really see a lot of Asians on TV, maybe on the news here and there, but even in commercials. So we kind of are the invisible, but we're also, it's like, I feel like I was suppressed by our culture. Like, we should not be loud. Women should not be loud. Asian women should not speak their truth, should not be. My dad would always say, women should not swear. You should not speak up. You have to be more subdued. And I felt like that was kind of where my dad and I had some there was resistance with my dad, because I kind of broke the mold with my family. I'm very outspoken. I'm very Americanized. And I think my dad had a hard time with that. But yeah, I think that in many ways, our culture forces us to be invisible.
Yeah, off of what Stephanie talked about, invisible, and I mentioned in the previous meeting, and I'm sure there's other, thoughts or, theories about why the Asian American community feels invisible. But as I thought about it, right, in my mind, the three key factors, right, the three key things, and Stephanie already touched upon one of them, is that it feels like there's a war between black and white in the United States, and it's been going on for years. I mean, it's part of our history, right? American history, right? And it's still going on. I mean, no matter how great Dr. Martin Luther King did to move the needle, and he didn't do it just for the African American community. He did it for all minority communities. And but it feels like we're in the middle of this battle, right? And therefore, everybody else is left out. Even though, as Sam says, maybe there's these one-offs here and there, but negligible, right, to the grand scheme of things in this waging war in the United States. So that's one. The second one, I believe, is the model minority myth that has been sort of like advertised, using some observation of our successes to try to create this narrative that we have no problems, there's no poverty, we're not even considered minority in colleges. I mean, for college applications or scholarships, because it's like, oh, we're overly represented in college, but by the definition, we're only 5% in the United States. How can we not be a minority, right? So this whole minority myth is just adding fuel to, oh, they're doing fine. Don't worry about them. They're doing fine. They don't need a place in the C-suite, upper executives or government or any higher places, right? Or any form of leadership, because they're doing just fine, and they don't need any type of subsidies or support, financial. They're doing just fine, so just leave them be, So that's, and what I hate about the minority myth is that it was being weaponized for one minority to be, pitted against another. And that's really unfortunate. And that should not be, And then the third one is, I feel like part of our culture is that we're just not really engaged in community and political affairs. Hopefully that's changing with the younger generation. But, we've always been taught, hey, keep your head down culture, right? To what Stephanie says, don't make any noise, right? In the American culture, right? The greasy wheel gets the grease, right? The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? In the Asian community, it's the nail that sticks out gets hammered, So it's very different. It's very different. So I think many of the younger generation, they're, and like Stephanie, right? Americanized, they understand that, very acutely. It's the older generation, the older culture that has residual effects on even the younger generations, to keep your head down. Don't vote, that's somebody else's battle. Whatever happens, right? Don't get involved with community or political affairs or help out your community or support other people. That could add to the fuel in terms of invisibility, because I feel like what you reap is what you sow. If you don't give back to the community or pay it forward, right, then people say, oh, I didn't know that you folks were around, and it may add to that invisible type of narrative. So,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I just want to say something really quick, just a quick word about this phrase, Asian American community. The Asian American community is not monolithic. We have East Asians, we have South Asians, we have Southeast Asians, we have Pacific Islanders. I hope I'm not leaving anything out, but it's a diverse group of people with many ethnicities. And actually, if you do group them as a demographic group, it is the largest wealth disparity of any demographic. We have the highest percentage of people in poverty within the Asian community. At the same time, super underrepresented in government. And that's why I agree with what Harvey was saying about this whole model minority concept that we're A-okay is but a myth.
I also wanted to echo a little bit of what everyone shared. I think this feeling of invisibility, I think also definitely, as some of you expressed, like plays out in media and just not seeing the representation in government offices. And I think something that I've been thinking a lot about is also like as I'm going on social media these days, I am seeing a lot of different Asian American, whether it's actresses or people who are in a position where they have a big platform, like speaking out. And I think recently in Koreatown, there was a rally and some people also sharing a little bit about what's been happening recently. And I think what I'm seeing is like that has in some ways has inspired me to feel that on the one hand, from those in power, they can give us the power to speak, or they can take that away. But I also think that as recently with all the things that are happening, what I am seeing is people coming together and sharing out on the platforms that they've been given, you know. And I think even this opportunity today to share a little bit about our experiences and our voice, it has in a sense made me realize that on the one hand, I think we can also in some ways come together during these times to speak out, you know. And I think with the government office and the political office, I also feel that, you know, that's somewhere where I feel like as Asian Americans being more engaged in our community is something that I've also realized is really important. Because I will say that I feel like in the past like 30 or so years of my life, I haven't really been so engaged politically and just being more aware myself and like educating myself with what's been happening. And I don't know if it comes from my parents or just my own choice, but I do think recently the awareness that it is important for myself to inform myself of what's happening and to also share, you know, to speak out what I think is wrong. And so I do see there are steps where we are coming out of this feeling of being invisible. And I think that has given me some hope. And I know that, I don't know how that's been like for some of us here and what we're seeing within our own communities. And even having conversations with my family, which we've never had before. Like today, this morning, I asked my mom about, you know, has she experienced racism in her workplace and what was that like? You know, and having that conversation with her, which I've never felt comfortable necessarily addressing with my own parents. And so in some ways, I think that there is this rising up of just this feeling that we don't have to stay invisible, but that even if we're not given that space, we can create that space in so many different ways. And so I was just wondering, in terms of what you guys are seeing within your own families and communities, are you seeing more of people speaking out a little and sharing their own experiences as well?
I wanted to mention one more thing about the, you know, because Asians are so underrepresented on the news, on TV, the media in the US, when an incident happens with an Asian on the news, like the guy that from Yale who got shot by another guy, and, you know, it's like I get a call from my brother. My brother lives in North Carolina, you know, also American born, and he's like, man, these guys are making us look bad. It's like instantly, the one person that gets shown on the news, and, you know, every day you have, you know, millions of whites, blacks being represented on the news, on TV and media, music, whatever, but very minimal Asians. So as soon as one thing happens, it's like, boom, you know, all of a sudden, all Asians, you got to watch out, they carry guns, or all of us. So I'm not surprised with the pandemic and the news having it come from Wuhan that all of a sudden all of this is going on right now. It's really not that surprising to me, because, you know, had we been represented in the media as having a lot of actresses, a lot of singers, we're known for our good music. I mean, you know, the Black and African Americans, they have a lot of their music, you know, a lot of it's like the hip hoppers, the rap, but we don't really have a lot of that in the US. I can't even think of one Asian singer that's, you know, in the US that's pretty popular, not that I know of. So I feel like, yeah, as soon as one thing hits the news, it happens to be an Asian, you know, people might start looking at the Asians differently. And that's it kind of, and, you know, my best friend who is white, I grew up in Glastonbury, Connecticut, predominantly a white community. And she said to me when all this was going on, she goes, you know, when a white person gets on the news and they shoot somebody or they kill somebody, she goes, I don't even think twice that they're representing me. You know, she's like, I really have like this white privilege thing where it's just a guy on the news and, oh, another person got shot, whatever. But as soon as like an Asian, and I don't know if blacks feel, and I think Jaleith and I had this conversation too. One black guy goes on the news, does something bad, shoots a white guy. All of a sudden it's like, oh my God, this black guy did this horrible thing, or this Asian person did this horrible thing. Maybe we need to watch out for these people. So I would like to know from the white, you know, Caucasian group, do you feel that when you see someone white on the news doing something, do you have that effect?
As the white guy here, I don't like all of you. I don't represent the whites. You know, I'm just a white guy, and I don't represent the totality. I can tell you though, it is interesting because white people are at the cross section of all of these conversations. Obviously, the majority culture, and so that makes sense. I also do know that if we are to unpack Asian American hostility rate, that there are other ethnicities involved. Asian American community, African American community have had hostilities, whites. And so it's a super complex thing. But to answer your question, Stephanie, honestly, I think things have shifted to a certain sense. And this, Sam and I were talking about, I hate the idea everything that you guys said and feel is real. I think one of the things that is unfortunate is as we speak up to some of these things, there tends to be the culture wars. And so, for example, there was, after the shooting in Atlanta, there was this shooting in Boulder. And at first it was like, here we go, another white guy. And then before the narrative hit, it turns out, oh, he's a Muslim man. And so then the narrative flipped the other way. And so I guess to say that, not to see like, oh, poor me, white guy or anything like that, but I do feel like that there are times where, yeah, it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it is perpetuated. Here we go, another white serial killer or mass murderer, or whatever the case is. So I don't know. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I get your greater point is not how do white people feel about that, but how in juxtaposition do minorities, and specifically tonight, Asian Americans feel when that, what you had kind of said. But I want to encourage you for a moment and to say thank you, because you guys sharing all this, I know when I was starting to have conversations, it was eye-opening, enlightening, and helpful for me. And even as I said this morning at our church service, I said, you know, one of the cool things about having is that we do have a diverse church. One of the challenging things is that it makes our work harder to have unity. That we like, and I don't say that in a bad, like, poor us. It's like, it's a great blessing, but it's also a great responsibility that we have to have conversations like this and navigate and be uncomfortable, and maybe say something, you know, one of us says something, maybe I said something offensive, and that you guys work with me, show me grace, point that out, and we learn and grow together. But if we're so afraid of tiptoeing on one of the and dancing around the edges, we're never going to really get to truth, lower the barriers, and come alongside each other. And I want to use this to say that one of the comments that we had on here, and I hope that this is encouraging to you all, is, let me skip down. Oh, we got away from me. But anyway, it was Carrie who basically said, thank you for sharing your stories. And what can we do to help? And so I know Carrie, she's a white woman, but she's asking, like, listening to you and hearing all this and just asking. So I don't know if there's anything that any of you would like to share about that. But what I want you to know as a pastor is we hear you, we see you, we love you as our brothers and sisters in Christ. We also agree that it's unacceptable, not just for people to attack Asian American elderly or women. Of course, that's unacceptable, but also men, any person, like an entire, the whole idea of attacking a person, and as Sam said, being cruel based on how God designed them. And God designed, he designed ethnicity, he designed race, he designed distinctions, and he said it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's good, it's his validation, his creation. We're all that way. So to go against that is to go against God, the creator, and to spit in his face as you spit on his creation. And so we all stand with you, we all stand against that. But maybe to speak to Carrie's question, any thoughts on how someone listening say, how do we come alongside you? Or how can we help?
Yeah, Bill, I guess I think it's all about, I think this is this concept of allyship, right? Which is something that I'm still learning. I'm embarrassed to admit that this is something that I'm still a baby at. I'm at baby level at. But Bill, I told you this, and I guess I'm going to say this again, but Bill, you as a white male and a leader of an organization, what you're trying to do here actually comes at a cost to you. I think it comes at a cost because, you know, maybe you are standing up and speaking up at the risk of getting people fired up against it. Maybe it comes at a cost to you, and maybe it comes with zero benefit, like at least zero self-serving benefit. So I just want to thank you for your allyship, coming at a cost with no benefits. Number two, I think allyship is something that is important because it's an opportunity to learn. It's a two-way street of learning where we learn from each other through allyship. And one more, number three, I would say allyship is all about mourning with those who mourn. And when the Atlanta shooting happened, I think the most hurtful thing was the quick dismissal of it being racially motivated. It was just quickly dismissed by the local police, by local government officials, by the media, certainly, that they wanted to separate this racism from the misogyny, which no one argues that it was indeed a misogynist act. But why is it either or? Why can't it be both? And so I think it's hurtful to do that quick dismissal to an already hurting community. I think allyship means that you're mourning with those who mourn. Allyship means, and I think that means it's empathy. It means it's compassion. What the Bible and what the gospel calls us all to do and be. I would say if a non-Asian person calls out anti-Asian sentiment, there's power there. If I call it out, it's not as powerful as if a non-Asian says, if someone says kung flu this or kung flu that, I think you call it out. You say, excuse me, can you not use that phrase? I mean, it's made popular by elected officials, but can you please use COVID-19? Can you please use the word coronavirus? And if they refuse, you push back and you dialogue and you explain why that's hurtful language to an already hurting community. And so I think it's about allyship.
Sam, thank you. And we are looking at our time at 7:53 here. We've got about 7 minutes left. So I'm going to take this time to position that question, but also to we'll give everyone a chance just to say, just wanted to be mindful of that, to give time to share some maybe final thoughts on this. And it seems like we'll have to have a further episode of this down the line because there's a lot to unpack and we had more kind of prep to talk, but that's okay. So let me just say other thoughts. And Harvey, I know you had a thought you wanted to share.
Yeah, I just want to come off of what just Sam says. Yeah, if you guys could definitely help us because it's more powerful when you guys champion us, right? Help defend us in the sense that if you see something, say something. If you see something, do something, right? Help us correct those that are off the mark in that regard, right? But you said that Karen says how else we can help. I just want to make sure that folks recognize that racism ultimately is self-defeating, and you might think about yourself like, what does Harvey mean by that? I've been looking at history, right? And don't forget, Irish people were violently attacked and was racist against when they came over from Ireland because of the British oppression. And there was a lot of racism against the Irish in the United States. The Italians, the same way. Germans were hated against during World War I in the United States. So if you're a German American of German descent, because of World War I against the Germans and the Kaiser, there was a lot of things that were done against the German Americans, destroying their culture, their language here in the United States. So I want to challenge folks to think about racism, and that you say you're white, right? But you do come from a certain ethnic lineage. All right, nobody is just pure white for the sake of white. You come from a certain ethnic lineage. My challenge to you is go back to your ethnic lineage, learn your history, and learn how it's quite possible, if not, it's probably possible, that's what happened, that your folks also suffered some form of racism down the line. So in that sense, perhaps you can relate. Because right now, it's probably not as easy to relate because it feels like somebody else's problem of Asian Americans. I just want to tie one more thing in, is that Galatians 3:28 says, and if you're a Christian, Jesus says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you're all in one Christ Jesus. So I just want to bring us all in to realize that, you know, Jesus even spoke to this, right? That, hey, crossing sexes, you know, crossing socioeconomic status, crossing races, right? We still belong to the body of Christ. So if you guys see conduct unbecoming a Christian, whether it's in the news or within our family, in our church, please say something.
Thank you, Harvey. Stephanie, do you have some thoughts before we wrap?
Solidarity, you know, it's not just Asian hate, but there's, you know, still racism with the Black community. And, you know, I guess historically Asians and Blacks have not really come together to join forces in battling racism. And I think now's the time, you know, and Harvey mentioned before, like, I think we can learn a lot from the African Americans who have been dealing with this and still are dealing with it today. But, you know, join in solidarity and join together and, you know, figure out if we can find a way to combat racism overall.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Angela, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I had two things I wanted to share. One, I appreciate Carrie asking that question. She's actually my family group. So I think I really appreciate the fact that there are people who are asking how we're doing. I think sometimes the willingness to want to understand and to listen, I think is extremely powerful, especially if it's also happening just in private conversation. You know, those are places where I think people can really connect and share some of the things that are, you know, on their minds. And I think it's powerful to ask that question, especially with your Asian American friends, reaching out to them and building those relationships. I think two is awareness. I think though race, I think sometimes we don't want it to be present or an issue. I do think the awareness of where we're coming from and what communities might be hurting, even in our words and our actions and the things that we might say, though we might not, it might not come from a place of like wanting to necessarily harm in what we say. I think just the awareness of what we're saying sometimes, or the questions we ask, or the things that we might feel like are connecting points with different groups of people, I think, and recognizing that there is hurt going on currently with the Asian American community. So I think it's those two main things I wanted to share.
And I think I just want to underscore what Angela just said to all my non-Asian American friends. You know, sometimes it's like, well, I don't understand, and why are people upset? This is why we're doing this, so you can hear the voices and hear the heart and understand that. Now, once you understand that, it doesn't even, you say, well, I don't, look, here's the thing. Again, mourn with those who mourn, empathize with those who empathize, understand wherever you can understand, but don't explain away experience, don't explain away emotion, even if you don't yet fully understand it. And what we are called to do is come alongside and care for one another, love one another, support one another. And so what I hope everyone here and everyone listening and everyone in our church knows is we stand with you, we stand for you, we support you. You're not alone. And I'm glad that you're all taking risks and speaking up today and helping us to learn. And I hope it's in some way helpful for you as you have an opportunity to share. But before we wrap, Jaleith, any final thoughts, or as you scan Facebook, any questions we should quickly hit on?
Sure.
If they're not quick hit, then we can't get to them today, I guess.
LOL. So we won't. But I'll just add, just to further emphasize, you know, partnering with other communities of color. I think that's a great idea. I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of work already being done to fight racism and to fight bias, implicit biases and prejudices, and you know, this othering that we do when someone's different from us. So, you know, build relationships, build authentic relationships with people is the advice that I would give. And then in terms of just some of the questions that have come up, were really centered around, you know, what your children's experiences have been throughout the pandemic, if they've seen an increase in othering. And I think that question really came up when, Angela, you were speaking about bringing your snacks to school. And then we've also seen a lot of just appreciation. Sancy says, thank you all for speaking out today and sharing your stories with us. She's joining in solidarity. I'm not going to repeat Paul's comment, but you can see what he said on Facebook. Sean said, thank you all so much for being willing to share. It's not easy to potentially make yourself even more vulnerable, but I personally really appreciate the candor and the courage. And I can't see all the comments on my computer. Okay. Aida said, thank you, Stephanie. As a Latina Mexican American, I can relate to your comments. Thank you for speaking up. So I think you should all be encouraged that you're sharing your experiences and voicing your stories is helping other people, you know, be able to process their own experiences, and also helping people to learn and, you know, combat their own unknowings. I feel like that's a nicer way to, to identify things. So yeah, those are all of the comments. But also check back Facebook later on tonight or tomorrow, because some people may be rewatching the recording. So
Yeah, well, thank you, Jaleith, Sam, Stephanie, Harvey, Angela. We appreciate you guys being on here. Thank you for everyone that watched on Facebook. We've got a wrap. This is Race and Redemption episode 6. This is the end for tonight. Is it, what is it? Yeah, 6. All right. It's the end for tonight, but really what we do from here is what matters. Continue to be a bridge builder. As my friend, Dr. David Anderson, the author of Gracism, says, comprehension begins with conversation. So what we're doing tonight is just the beginning. It's building the bridge, having the conversation. So what we do from here matters. So thank you so much. Appreciate all of you. God bless you. And we'll see you next time.